everybody, we're friends. You might not know that, but we're friends already, and I'm happy to see you all. Also, my shirt has dinosaurs on it, and I need to make sure that you understand that, okay? We covered the important bases here. Thank you for whoever clapped. When they said it's bright, what I didn't realize is that I can't see individual faces. That makes me sad because I really like kind of making eye contact and seeing when people are nodding or really engaged and stuff like that. So I'm gonna imagine that you're all super, super engaged this entire time, and if it's not, just don't snore, and then I won't notice it, and it'll be totally fine. So this talk is called Laravel in the Enterprise, and you may have thought, wait a minute, that seems kind of familiar. Didn't you give a talk called Laravel in the Enterprise in the past? And no, look at the underlined word, it was called Laravel and the Enterprise. Not the same talk, but it was 5 years ago at Laravel Live UK. And this one is Laravel in the Enterprise, so you can tell it's a completely different talk, and nobody's gonna ever know the difference. To be honest, there are some similarities. You are gonna notice that if you've seen it before, or if you looked at the speaker deck for the last talk, there's a decent amount of overlap, but they don't have the same motivation. The motivation for the first talk, I did start my timer. The motivation for the first talk was to convince people that Laravel can be used in the enterprise. And people were saying, Laravel is just for startups, Laravel is just for rapid application development. And the talk was to say, no, that's not the case. Laravel is useful in all these other contexts. Here's why, and here's a whole bunch of people who've used it in the enterprise and proving it and trying to make sure it's true, yada, yada. We're past that crap. Now let's talk about what it looks like to use Laravel in the enterprise because you're doing it. It is in the enterprise everywhere. We don't need to have the question of whether it deserves to be there. Let's talk about how we do it, how we use it when we're there. So I asked this question when I was writing the first talk. It says, I'm seriously considering giving a talk about Laravel in the enterprise. What should I cover? I asked the same question again a couple months ago, and the answers to both were both primarily the same question, which is, what does enterprise actually mean? Which is probably important for us to go through if this talk is entirely about the enterprise. So, of course, we want to look at the official definition. It's a noun, it's also an adjective, because enterprise Laravel. But the thing is, nobody really fully knows or understands or agrees on what enterprise actually is. There's no kind of shared definition around this concept. So, of course, we go to Wikipedia. There's actually some very helpful things at Wikipedia. I don't even have to go to some other definition sites. Enterprise software is computer software used to satisfy the needs of an organization rather than individual users. So we're already understanding the fact that we're talking not just about business to consumer, where you're thinking about one person sitting on their phone, but the software is actually targeting the company, okay? So that's helpful. It also says it's a collection of computer programs with common business applications, tools for modeling how the entire organization works, and development tools for building applications unique to the organization. So now we recognize we're not just targeting the companies, we're actually already trying to model how these companies run in our software, which is unique because you're not trying to model a person or a person's life in software all the time, but with enterprise tools, we're actually trying to model business processes. And then finally, Martin Fowler says it's about the display, manipulation, and storage of large amounts of often complex data and the support or automation of business processes with that data. So that's kind of interesting because we have two pieces here. The first piece is big, complicated data, which is a little bit different than what we've been talking about. And then the second piece is support and automation of business processes, which is exactly what we've been talking about. And one of the things this shows us is that when you're talking about enterprise, you're not just talking about the fact that it is in an enterprise. There are things that commonly come along with enterprise or enterprise software that is usually what people are really talking about. They're not talking about, hey, it's an enterprise. They're saying, it's an enterprise. Enterprise software or companies normally have XYZ. Therefore, it's really about the XYZ. So we're going to talk about the XYZ because that way we're not making assumptions about what enterprise means, which is where most of the confusion around this topic actually comes. I also asked on Twitter and got some answers that were actually, they're funny, but they're actually revealing. I don't think you can find consensus on what enterprise means, which means your audience will spend an hour arguing, but that's not enterprise instead of learning. You know, it's enterprise if we spend more time in meetings than we do building things. An enterprise is just code for, I have no idea what I'm doing in a project this big. Please take this money and give me a 1-800 number to call when beep goes south, okay? Those are funny, but it's actually true because we're talking, again, not just about, oh my gosh, coding considerations. There's also process considerations. There's people's considerations. There's organizational considerations that are different when you're in the enterprise, which usually means bigger teams and stuff like that. So here's what we're going to cover. What is enterprise? A quick note on can you use Laravel in the enterprise? Key considerations for code and for process, and then a quick summary at the end because that's how I work. So what is enterprise really? In my mind, I thought about 8 factors, and these factors being on one or another side of their particular potential or individual scales makes it more likely to be enterprise. So I'm going to show you the 8 factors, and then we're going to show you where along those scales they are. So we've got team size, dev team size, customer base size, the amount of legal and compliance constraints that you have to deal with, the length of your projects, complications of operations and deployment, distance between the dev team and other teams like product, and then finally the pain if your application goes offline. You've heard these, and you can probably guess the direction each of these are going when you're in enterprise. Team size, large. Dev team size, large. Customer base size, large. Legal and compliance constraints, lots of them. Length of projects, long. Complications of applications and deployments, operations deployments, lots. Distance, great. Pain, lots, okay? So when you have all these individual things that could be difficult on your average project, these individual things in enterprise are almost always at their maximum difficulty, right? We're not like, oh, like this thing's hard or that thing's hard. Enterprise usually means everything that could potentially be hard is all hard at the same time. And that's why enterprise has so many people asking so many questions or poking at so many things, because it's where we're the pickiest at making sure this thing actually works. So then we need to ask this baseline question that I asked in my last talk, which is Laravel Enterprise ready? And the answer is, of course. If you really want to dig into this question, go look at my speaker deck for the last talk. But the thing is, it's been set. It's working in a jillion enterprise applications. We work with them at Titan all day long, all the time, moving on, okay? Code considerations for the enterprise. I want to talk about a few primary things you should think about when you're considering writing code and building coding teams in the enterprise. But before I talk about code, I want to name something, which is that the majority of the time people ask the question of how to write code in the enterprise, they're making the mistaken assumption that the code is the problem. Your coding standards, your organizations, the tools, the frameworks, those are the things that hold you up in the enterprise. But at Titan, we work with hundreds and hundreds of customers, many of which are in the enterprise, and I can tell you across the board, there's one primary problem when you're working with applications in the enterprise. You can ignore the rest of the talk if you understand this. The problem is, the biggest threat to enterprise Laravel apps is leadership, whether it's a CTO or a CEO, whatever, who thinks insert buzzword is the most important thing and doesn't actually understand why. That causes more problems than anything we've ever seen. And there are other big problems. It's the biggest problem because you must have microservices. You must have API first. You must have SPAs, you must have domain-driven design or CQRS or Node or Java or whatever else. So you must have bang PHP, anything but PHP, right? Like that, not knowing why you need those things, but ensuring that you must have them leads to incredibly terrible decisions in terms of staffing, technical decisions, rewrites, all that kind of stuff, because somebody heard that the competitor has it, or somebody heard that everybody who's doing real code has it. And so you get stuck implementing this thing with no reason. And if you do something with no reason, that's the worst possible place to be in as a programmer. If you have ever heard me give a talk about Yagni, you understand that's where we're coming from. Okay, so now that we've covered that, let's actually look at some coding considerations that when you're working in the enterprise, these coding situations are more likely to come up. And the first one is, surprise, Yagni. If you've never heard me talk about it before, Yagni means you aren't going to need it. I've given lots of other talks at greater extent to this, including one very recently, so go take a look at those if this is a new concept to you. However, it is even more relevant in the enterprise for several reasons. The first reason is you have bigger teams, you have bigger code, you have bigger needs, which means you have bigger needs for structure. Structure, whether it's structure of your code, structure of your teams or whatever, is the most likely source of over-engineering. And over-engineering means you build things that you don't need, that make you way locked down and inflexible, so when you hit a real problem down the road that you couldn't have predicted when you were building things you didn't need, now it's much harder to meet the needs of that problem down the road. And the second thing is what we've already talked about here, which is that enterprise means you have more people around who have been coding for a long time and maybe haven't coded for the last 10 years, and it's their job to just show up with opinions, right? Those people are more prevalent in enterprise settings. You've got the CTO who hasn't coded in 20 years, but knows that they can keep saying you must use whatever technology, and people will keep paying them millions of dollars to do it. So enterprise has way more people who have no idea what they're talking about saying you must do something without actually being able to explain why you must do it. Yagni, 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 okay? Tell those people we can do these things, but why, okay? And that's what Yagni is about. I asked everybody at Titan, do you have any insight that I should be considering when I give this talk about enterprise? And I got a few really great quotes from folks. This one from Anthony Clark is not Anthony's original idea. I believe I quoted Sarah Bine saying a similar thing last talk, but this is a very helpful idea. It's a lot easier to make simple things complex than it is to make complex things simple. So if you start at the beginning of your project and you say, here are all the things that might possibly happen in this enterprise project over the years, and then you build the best tooling you think for all of them, when you hit the reality, which is never what you predicted, you've now built this super complicated spaghetti nested tool that handles 17 different things, but not the one you want, which means it's inflexible, and it's not very good at changing. If you heard me give a talk before, you probably have also seen Constantine before. We love Constantine. I wish he could just show up to every single one of my talks instead of just Photoshop him in. He gave this fantastic talk at Laracon EU called Min-Maxing Software Costs. And in this talk, he talked about a lot of the same concepts I'm doing here from a much more technical bent. But one of the most important things he said in the entire talk was, if you want to change the world with your product, then change is the primary thing your product must prepare for. You don't know what's coming. You can't predict the future. Your CEO can't predict the future. Your CTO can't predict the future. Those people in product can't predict the future. And if they think they can and say you must build around it, that's when you get rigid, unchangeable things. And that is more important to allow for future change than to try and predict it now. So YAGNI, according to some people's criticism, means you shouldn't do any planning, right? Oh, it's all you rapid application developers saying, let's just go wing it like cowboys in every single one of our applications. It does not mean don't plan. What it means is put your energy and your time now into things that make you flexible later. So do your planning, do your complexity, do all your structures now to allow you to do a better job of addressing the problems as they come up because you have not hit them yet. So when you hit them, do work now to make it good for when you hit them. Kent Beck says software design is not about minimizing design complexity, but rather spending our complexity budget where it can do the most good. So this is what we're talking about here. It's not about never making complicated systems. It's not about never planning. It's never about looking to the future. But you should put the future into the things that you know will happen. What will happen? You'll have programmers. You'll want those programmers to be fast. You'll want them to be flexible and agile in response to new things. So target those things. Those are the only things you really know are going to happen. I'm going to do a tiny note about scale. YAGNI and scale often come up because in an enterprise and also in lots of startups, they say, oh, but what happens when we hit 20 million or whatever? And so they build these extremely complicated systems because of the potential of scale. First of all, the vast majority of the folks who do that will never actually hit the scale they think they're going to. However, in the enterprise, it is more likely, because if you're in the enterprise, you naturally have a large user base. So unlike many startups, you're more likely to hit that 20 million than a lot of startups who may never hit it at all. However, thinking about scale still has these same constraints that I would give to a startup who may never hit 20 million, which is there's no one magical tool for scaling. Just like all the rest of this YAGNI stuff, you don't actually know what's coming, which means you can't predict the things that are going to happen, which means you should instead see the scale issue and then respond to it, just like all these other things we've been saying here. So for example, if you're hitting the fact that your database uses too much RAM or something like that, that's a great time to extract your database to a separate server, but you don't need to do it before that. If you're hitting an issue where no matter how great you write your SQL queries, it's just going to be a little slow, great time to add caching on that query, right? Or if all of your pages look exactly the same because you're building a marketing site, great time to do HTTP caching or varnish caching or something like that. So caches are probably your first place to start because they're often very inexpensive to implement relative to other performance tuning things. So think about CDNs, think about Cloudflare, HTTP caching, that kind of stuff. But in general, you just want to make sure that you don't do things early except this last one. The thing you should do very early for every single thing that will prepare you for scale is make it as easy as possible to spin up a new instance of your app. It's going to help you in a million other ways, but in scale, it means you can do all sorts of different types of sharding and load balancing and stuff like that. And the number of times we run into people who can't do that, which means they therefore have to pour more and more and more resources into a single instance when they really could just spin up 4 instances behind a load balancer, but it takes 3 years to spin up a new instance of their app, which hurts them in other ways. Just make it super easy from the very beginning to spin up your app, and you're already setting yourself up for a lot more success in scale. So those are the most important pieces for me from a code perspective. I'm going to give you a couple other just miscellaneous notes because these are things that come up. But again, if you walk away with nothing else from this, know that Laravel can do the enterprise. All the things that we're running into the enterprise we can run into elsewhere, but in enterprise they're all together in one. Be wary of anybody who says you need to use a buzzword without knowing why, and YAGNI. Those are the most important things. Everything else here is just kind of like gravy on top. Still good, but those are the most important pieces. All right, so stick to conventions. If you've heard me give a talk before, I tell this to everybody, but it's even more important into the enterprise. If Laravel or any of the other tools you have established conventions, stick to their conventions. Don't make yours the little magical snowflake that looks different than everybody else's. It's very fun, and it burns you in a million ways down the road. Here's a couple reasons why you should stick to conventions. It requires less decisions. If you're in the enterprise, you have to do decisions by group or decisions by committee, which everybody knows means it's going to take 3 months for you to make the simplest decision about your code. If you make the decision up front that you're going to stick with Laravel's defaults, then you just get that out of the way, and now there's less cost and less meetings. Plays nicer with future tools. Let's imagine you decided that we're not going to use Laravel's native auth because we have some senior engineer who hates Laravel and thinks they can write a better auth system than Laravel. Other reasons that's a problem, but now one day down the road you want to add SSO, or you want to add some cashier, or something else that integrates natively with Laravel's auth system. Well, sorry, y'all can't use it because you hand-rolled your auth. However, if you stick with each of the native tools, it plays together with all the other native tools and the third-party tools that are meant to integrate with those tools themselves. It allows you to onboard new devs more easily, and this is for 2 reasons. First of all, you have to write less documentation, which means you're less likely to get in a situation where you realize, oops, we forgot to write that documentation, and then new people can't use it. But second of all, if you're onboarding a new developer and you need to hire somebody who can comprehend your whole system, the more of your system that is unique and special and snowflakey, the more work they have to do to onboard. The more you do the native things the way that Laravel suggests you should do it, or Vue or Livewire or whatever else, the more you just have to hire somebody who already knows Laravel. If you hire somebody who knows Laravel, Livewire, Vue, or whatever else, and then your app works the way they're supposed to, that person starts on day one and knows where everything goes and knows where everything's supposed to be. One more quote that I really appreciate from Konstantin's talk that I quote all the time is, own everything you write and try not to write anything. This is great because the more you own, the more you have to update, the more you have to be responsible for bugs, the more you have to comprehend when a new person comes into the project, right? So the less you own, the less unique and special code that you have written for your application, the safer you are in dozens of ways. Well, it turns out if you stick to conventions and you use the native built-in tools with your framework and other things, you're writing less, you're owning less. And when this huge security issue that comes out that affects how passwords are hashed, Taylor can deal with it. And you just take this update that he gives you a couple days down the road. Get yourself in as many situations as possible where something goes terrible in the world and you can just say, I know that this wonderful community whom I love and who I give lots of money to and support them and sponsor them and all that other kind of stuff, they're gonna fix it and I'm gonna get the benefit of that. Don't be in places where too many things could break and you're the person who has to fix it. To build on top of this, you do have to have some unique decisions you're gonna make. Laravel's not gonna make all the decisions for you, right? So set your own standards and conventions for code standards and folders and stuff like that. Keep it as close to native Laravel as possible, but you need to set it, you need to define it, you need to automate it, and you need to document it. So figure out what coding standard you're gonna use, pick which tool you're gonna use. We've got one at Titan called Duster, there's Pint, there's Laracon, there's Rector, there's all these other ones, but pick whatever that system is gonna be, document it all super well so nobody ever can say, well, I didn't even know what I was supposed to be doing. Build automated tools, hook those automated tools into your CI/CD, and just move on, okay? This should not, again, no individual programmer should have their own special snowflake code. Everybody should know exactly how to write it. It should be written that way. It should be rejected if it's not written that way, or should be fixed. That's it. All right, for testing. People who are often talking about writing enterprise code are very often the people who are stingiest about making sure that unit tests are the way, isolated unit tests that don't touch anything. And a lot of the people who are very picky about how to do this are saying because when you write these integrated tests, it's gonna be really flaky and all that kind of stuff. And there's reasons why integration tests have been difficult in the past. However, you do wanna test to make sure that your code works, right? So you do wanna do a unit test. However, you need to make sure that your code also works together with the code that it's gonna touch. And again, that is even more likely to be a problem in the enterprise when often the code it's touching is not owned by your team. When you're a startup and there's two people, you probably either wrote or sit next to the person who wrote whatever systems your thing's talking to. When you're in the enterprise and you have 16 teams of 3 programmers, you are probably interacting with code that you didn't write and you don't understand why it works that way, you don't know what their changes are gonna be. So you need to write tests to make sure that they all play together nicely. If you've ever seen any of these memes, you'll understand what I'm talking about, but if you've not, you see this little lock, we check to make sure the lock works, this is wonderful, and then we actually test the integration, and oh crap, it's not actually locking anything. And it's funny, but it's funny because it's so true, because we can make sure that our little unit works, and it's sort of the same thing as works on my machine, right? We just go, la, 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 my unit tests are green, I don't have to worry about the fact that it's not actually sending anything anywhere. We have to play nicely together with other people, so our tests should cover it as well. 2 more things, run the tests often, run them automatically. Just like I was talking about with the linting, you should have a continuous integration pipeline. Every single company should have a continuous integration pipeline, so every single time you push up code or merge code, it gets tested and linted, period. There's no questions there, there's no reason not to be doing it, you should do it. You don't have to all do continuous deploy, which we'll talk about in a second, but you should all be doing continuous integration. However, continuous deploy is great. So, you want to make, and this is also copied from this specific note here is from somebody at Titan. I think this might have been Jacob. He said, make the time between I wrote the code and the code in production as short as possible. This is a very, very, very common problem we see in the enterprise, if possible deploying every push. The reason is the more frequently you ship code, the less traumatic shipping code will be like. And normally, big enterprise applications and big teams have these huge deploy steps where they're gonna do, well, we're gonna do feature branches into an epic, and then the epic's gonna be released every 3 months, but there's a 2-month test and release cycle while you're starting the next epic, and it's just gonna be this horrible, terrible system where everybody's terrified about releasing because there's always a whole bunch of problems, it always gets delayed, and when a bug happens, nobody even remembers writing the freaking code that caused the bug in the first place because you did it 4 months ago and that guy doesn't even work here anymore, right? You need to shrink the time down as best as you can, and there's so many reasons. There's a great article, I think I linked here, yeah, from Charity Majors that I think Tony Macias linked me to that's called Shipping Software Should Not Be Scary. Go take a read to it. I'll give links to all these at the end, so you don't have to take pictures now if you don't want. But basically the idea is you want to be in a place where you write the code, it goes through the test framework, it gets reviewed or whatever, and then it goes live. And then if you have a bug, you just have this really wonderful ability to say, oh, I wrote that yesterday. I know how to fix it. We'll do a real quick rollback. We'll fix it, we'll write a test, and then we keep moving. You want to be at a point where a bug in production doesn't cause everybody to freak out because, like, first of all, good luck rolling back 3 months of code that you just deployed. But second of all, who knows how to fix it or who deployed it or anything like that. So if you have this much quicker turnaround cycle, you have much easier ability to go say, you know what, it's a bug, it's no big deal, we know where it came from, we're going to fix it. When things do go wrong, whether it's because you just did a deploy or in general, I would say the more we can think of bugs and performance issues not as something that should make us all freak out and be terrified and worried about losing our jobs, but just a normal part of building and developing and deploying software, that's a really big win for us because then we can just say, oh, we have a performance issue. Well, hopefully we have great monitoring, so we caught it early. That is a sign to us that now we can go do performance optimization. We didn't need to do it a year ago when we didn't know it was coming. We have gotten a sign from on high that we have a performance issue on the dashboard. Okay, well, we kind of probably should have predicted dashboards always have performance issues, but now we can address that specific thing because we go in with our analytics tools, we figure out what's causing that, optimize the queries, and then we're done. Similar with bugs. Bugs aren't fun, but bugs that you wrote code in for three days ago, you fix the bug, you write a test, you're good to go. Those are, if we can see those as not like life-ending problems, but just a normal part of doing life, it will be a significantly better experience for everybody, including the people who can't even fix it, because they'll say, oh, there's an error, I'll pass it off to the dev team, they'll have it fixed in 2 hours, and we'll push it again, which you can't do if it takes 3 months to push a fix, right? You see how these are all kind of working together. There's plenty of tools to identify these problems. From a performance perspective, you've got things like debug bar and optimizers and the query timers and everything like that. You also want bug tracking services installed, and there's plenty of solutions to consider. But for bugs, you want to fix it, you want to test it. From performance things, there's all sorts of options like caches and queued jobs and microservices and all of that. I should have put this at the top. Fail fast, fix fast. Overall, rather than being terrified of ever failing, recognizing that we're going to fail at times, there's going to be bugs, and let's just fix them right away, and it's going to be so much easier. All right, so when you're working with external services, which is something we do a lot, we are working with some kind of API or some kind of storage situation or something like that. This is a tip from Tony Macias that at first I was not 100% on board with, and I've become 100% on board with, so I want you all to really consider this. Even if this external service has an SDK, which means they give you a software package that allows you to interact with it, still build a thin abstraction layer in front of that you own. Here's why. If you own the abstraction, it's easier to standardize, which means if you're using multiple providers, they can all have the same API, which makes your code simpler. It's easier to test because many SDKs, or especially if you don't even have an SDK, don't have great testing frameworks, so they don't work the same way as yours. So now you can just swap different implementations in and out in your tests because you're just swapping out your own abstraction, not dealing with whatever weird testing framework that person who's working on PSR 72 decided to implement in there, right? They're easier to swap depending on the environment. So if you need to use the production version in production, you need to use the staging version somewhere else, and you need to use a file-based driver at home, it's a lot easier to use if you're doing that with your own abstraction. And if you're going to eventually extract this to use a different service, or, which we see happen all the time in the enterprise, if their service is flaky and is slow and is expensive and is maybe about to charge you 3 times more because they've got you in, you can now build your own internal microservice to provide the same thing and just build a microservice that basically matches that same abstraction, and you don't have to go rip their SDK out of all your code because the SDK was only ever touched by your abstraction in the first place. I know I'm kind of breezing through these, but I want to get to process, and these are all nice, but you can understand them pretty quickly. Build local seeders, please. Dear God, please build local seeders. Don't give new people or contractors who come into your application a dump of production database, okay? Preferably build local seeders that get you in different states. So you've got that one user who stopped paying 3 months ago. You've got some user who has more people than they're allowed for their plan, whatever it's going to be. Take good care of your local seeds, another quote from Tony Macias. And this is one thing I want to point out. You should build good seeders, and then you should maintain good seeders, because your application and its needs for testing change over time. And so if you built great seeds on day 1, and then 6 months down the road haven't touched them, people will stop using the seeds, and they'll go back to getting production dumps. At the very minimum, get a production dump, go through and have your data service person manage the PII and make sure it's not private, no private information in there, it's all been anonymized, and then save it as a SQL file and have your seeders load that. Very, very minimum. But going to the place where somebody spins up a new instance of your app and they literally can't even get it working because it doesn't have the interrelated data is going against all the things we've been talking about so far about making it easier for new people to onboard. And my last thing, because these two are so specifically and frequently mentioned by people in the enterprise, microservices and API first. Okay. Microservices and APIs, just like everything else we've talked about so far, should meet real needs. You shouldn't build a microservice unless you've discovered that the service that already existed had a problem. You shouldn't build an API unless you actually have a practical need for that API. Further, if you build microservices or APIs before you're ready for them, you're going to build them poorly because you don't know the actual needs they're trying to address. So I'm not saying you shouldn't build them. I'm saying you're going to build better ones when you build them when you need them. Great article from Signal versus Noise about the majestic monolith can become the citadel about what a healthy process of extracting microservices out of monoliths can look like. Finally, I think API first is overrated. Really quick reason behind this. People imagine that if they do API first, they'll build an API, they'll build an SPA in front of the API, and then later they'll get a free mobile app API out of it, and they'll build their mobile app and it won't be any work. What happens in reality is it takes you 3 times as long to build your web app as it would have taken if you just used native technologies. You have to learn SPAs, and you end up building an API that's super, super, super tightly integrated with your SPA. And then one day, if you do eventually maybe have a mobile app, you turn out that it doesn't need the same API resources and routes that you built, because you didn't really build a true REST API. You built one that served that SPA, and you just have a second API now. So your web app took longer to build, it's more complicated, and now you got 2 APIs. Nobody wants that. API first is overrated. I'm not saying nobody should ever do it. I've seen people do it well, but it's not the most common situation. All right, I got 5 minutes to talk about process. I think we can do this. All right, so if you've ever worked in the enterprise, this is going to be familiar with you. If any of you have ever seen Office Space, this will be familiar to you. If lunch is in 4 minutes, you sit there silently and don't laugh at my jokes. Thank you. All right, so things we need to think about from a process perspective. Number 1, we've already talked about this a little bit, but make onboarding easy. More developers in the enterprise, more new developers in the enterprise, more junior developers in the enterprise, and more developers who are not familiar with tech stack in the enterprise, okay? All of those things mean you are more likely to run into the need to onboard new people than you would be anywhere else. So how do you do this? Well, we've talked about sticking to conventions. We talked about having your own conventions. And one thing you can also do is make sure that your code has IDE friendliness, so it's easier to kind of dive in through PHP Storm or whatever else. You might want some bash bin scripts to help people get set up, or maybe prepackaged local development environments, and make sure you have great tests and great seeds. Really focus on making sure that new programmers can get into your app as easily as possible. A lot of enterprise teams say, well, we don't really know how to manage this many people, so we're going to go to very, very, very strict process management strategies, and so they'll go into very strict waterfall, or they'll say we're in agile, and then they'll bring in a scrum master, and they're basically just doing waterfall under another name, and they build these very, very strict things thinking that these processes are going to fix their problems, and they just put nice new labels over their problems and allow you to pay more people more money to have the same problems. So look at the Agile Manifesto. Think about the word agile as different from agile. When you hear agile, you think, we are Scrum certified agile coaches, and we think of agile, you think of like a football player who kind of responded to things better. You want to be agile. You don't want to be agile. I mean, that's not that it's terrible, but you want to be agile so that you remain flexible to change. And most of these process management strategies are making you more rigid. They're locking you and saying the only way you can do this is if it fits within our 2-week sprint cycle. Well, what happens if I get 75% of the way in the sprint cycle and I want to start a new project? Well, you better not start it in a way that's not going to get done at the end of the sprint cycle, because God forbid you have half done work at the end of the sprint cycle. That's not benefiting anyone. We want to be able to just see the problems that come up in real coding situations and remain flexible to them. And whatever situation and whatever process management strategy allows you to do that is the right process management strategy. Technical debt management strategy. If you've ever worked in the enterprise, you've probably experienced the moment where you said, we need to fix this thing. We need to upgrade to the latest dependency of this. And product says, you can't do that because you got to work on this feature. You can't do that because we need to hit this launch date, or we need to hit this particular release target, or whatever else it ends up being, right? It is leadership's responsibility, it's not you as programmers, but the CTOs in here, the CEOs in here, the COOs, the tech leads, or whatever else. It is your responsibility to communicate to the other leaders in your company that having a healthy technical debt management strategy is not a pet fun thing for your programmers because they just like screwing around and upgrading things. It is a foundational need for the health of your company to make sure that you don't end up on the New York Times because you leaked everybody else's private information because you were on a 6-year-old version of PHP. Okay? And that needs to be understood, or the developers will constantly be seen as these little dorks who just want to sit around and upgrade stuff while product wants to get real work done. Tech debt management is real work, and none of those fancy features that product wants to develop will be any good if you're in a place where everything's out of date. This is my last point, and it is my most controversial point. In the enterprise, you are much more likely to find yourself in a scenario where people hire non-Laravel programmers to do Laravel work. And there's two angles of this. One of them is it's a brand new programmer who's coming in as an apprentice or a junior. Totally fine. Hire those people all day long. They'll learn really quickly in the enterprise. The other end is where you get senior PHP developers who are some kind of butthurt about Laravel's success. They're grouchy about it, and they want to come in and they say, oh, I can write Laravel because I can write PHP, so I can write anything. And then what they kind of doing is they undermine all the actual conventions of Laravel, all the tools that are there in Laravel, and those are the people who decide that they're going to write their own auth. They're going to roll their own SSO or something like that. And they screw your whole system up because they don't foundationally understand what Laravel can do. They want to do their own thing and be a superhero and be the ones who made the amazing auth system that's better than Laravel's, and they make your whole team less effective, less capable of utilizing the tools you already have out of the box, less easy to bring new programmers in, and more likely to introduce bugs because you're owning so much more code. So, controversial opinion, sorry to all the PHP programmers out there, but if you are hiring a senior level person, they need to be a Laravel programmer, okay? End of story. If they're a senior level person who doesn't write Laravel, bring them in at an entry level or a mid-level thing and allow them to learn Laravel as they go. But if your senior people can't write Laravel, it is going to screw up your Laravel app across the board. Stop doing that. You will thank me for it afterwards. All right, conclusions. Enterprise apps are just apps where everything that can be hard is hard. That's it. Therefore, the best practices for writing Laravel enterprise apps is just the best practices for writing the rest of Laravel apps. You just have to be really intentional about it because all the hard things are going to be there. More notes at enterpriselaravel.com, and if you need help with your Laravel enterprise application, come to us at titan.com or in the booth in the back. Thank you all so much.
Here I am. Good job. Well done. So I have a question based on some of the apps that y'all see at Titan. You mentioned at the beginning that Laravel is starting to finally get some adoption in the enterprise, at the enterprise level.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that is a function of time now that we've been around for so long, or do you feel like there's a vibe shift and PHP is about to take over the world?
I think we've had Laravel apps in the enterprise for the last 10 years, right? We have a client who's been using Laravel for the last 10 years. So it's been around, it's been in those places. But there has been a concept that if you're doing enterprise PHP, you need to do Symfony or you need to do Zend. Well, Zend doesn't do much these days, and Laravel and Symfony are buddies, right? Like, we're not a place where we're competing, and Symfony has been making a lot of changes so they can do application development as well. So in my experience, people are just understanding that you can do great stuff with both of them, and there's a lot of people who have worked in Laravel who are now finding themselves in these spaces. I've just met with somebody last week who's like, I've been trying to pitch for Laravel every place I go, and now I'm in this big space, and so now I'm trying to pitch for it here. So some of it is the function of just getting people into leadership positions who work with Laravel, because 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the people in senior leadership positions who'd been writing PHP for 20 years were writing something else for the last 20 years.
So it's somewhat a function of time. But there is a vibe shift.
There's a little bit of both. That's what I'm saying.
PHP is back.
I mean, you're part of it, so.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Everybody, Matt Stauffer.
Thank you all.